Hello, everyone. I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox, hosted by Richard Lummis.
What makes a great leader? Is it genetic, or can you learn leadership skills? Join Tom Fox and Richard Lummis in this podcast, where they consider leadership from a wide variety of perspectives: academic, behavioral science, history, popular culture, the movies, and much more. You'll learn about specific tactics and strategies that you can bring to your own leadership toolkit. 12 O'Clock High is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast about leadership. This is Richard Lummis. I'm here with Tom Fox for another discussion on how to improve our leadership skills. We believe leadership is a skill which can be improved with study of both good and bad practices. We try to draw interesting examples from many sources, including history, fiction, film, and business writing. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Today we'll be discussing a trifecta of failed leaders: Travis Kalanick of Uber, Adam Neumann of WeWork, and Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos. We've done podcasts on each of these case studies individually, but we thought it would be instructive to compare and contrast the three. I kind of saw this as a continuum ranging from fraud to actual business success combined with hubris on the part of the founder, and put WeWork somewhere in the middle. I know you have a slight difference of opinion on that, so where would you like to start?
So these are three of just the most recent failures. They were certainly public, all unicorns, all very much in the public eye, with visionary leaders. I saw this as a continuum in a different direction, which was starting with Travis Kalanick, and perhaps the Greek poets were right. Hubris is the greatest sin, or the greatest character defect, I should say. And his hubris brought down his leadership of Uber. It didn't bring down the company. Elizabeth Holmes, based upon Bad Blood, the book we both read, I really thought she had a vision and tried to create a product around that vision. That vision was something that could test blood in minuscule amounts, literally a pinprick amount. And in Bad Blood, it really detailed how for at least 4 or 5 years, she tried to create a mechanical contraption that could do it. And they were stymied by a variety of technical issues around both the mechanics and quality of the blood that was being tested. But at some point around 2011, something changed, and they went to outright deception, moving into fraud, and now Elizabeth Holmes is under criminal indictment for fraud, moving to Adam Neumann. And here, I wouldn't use the word fraud, but I would use the word huckster. And his vision to elevate the world through better office space and become president of the world and to do a variety of other things that he envisioned just didn't, it seemed to me, all I could think of is Amy Simple McPherson.
Yeah.
And hopefully listeners will understand that reference. But it just seemed to me he was able to con a lot of people to give him a lot of money, starting with SoftBank and giving him billions of dollars to run the company in the way that he personally saw fit. He was ousted as CEO, and he was given a golden parachute of over $1 billion in the face of literally 12,000 people being laid off, starting with the Thanksgiving holidays. So it seemed to me to be three different types of leadership styles, but really all three, I think, had certain characteristics in them that we can explore in the terms of leadership. So with, once again, Neumann was able to keep any scrutiny or his company from being scrutinized by any investors. There were clear signs of self-dealing, but because of his control and most importantly, people giving him money, he didn't have to answer to anyone and he didn't have to rectify those. Kalanick was seen as someone who was extraordinarily hard-charging, certainly disruptive, certainly visionary, but when things went wrong, his actions really didn't match his words. And then with Elizabeth Holmes, really I can't identify what it was that caused the change, but there was pretty clearly a change that the Theranos system did not work. The product didn't work. She wouldn't let anyone look at the product. She knew the product didn't work, and unfortunately for her, she made a very public show of saying it did work, and she was able to get people to continue to give her money without being able to do any due diligence on whether the product worked or not.
Well, we talked about the cult of the founder with respect to all three of these, and one of the things that I was thinking about with respect to Kalanick is he'd worked for years, working 60, 70, 80 hours a week. I wonder how much that has to do with this. Do they just flame out? It's incredibly demanding to do what these people do, and most of them don't seem to do it very well for very long before they have some sort of collapse like this.
Well, it's interesting you look at it that way, because of the three, I really thought only Kalanick had the collapse. And it was not sort of a 1 or 2 day and he was done or gone. It was a 6 month or maybe 4 to 5 month extraordinarily public series of events, series of past catching up to him, public perception changing. The Me Too movement was a big part of that. The inability of him to craft a coherent response, additional unforced errors, and I think finally a board recognizing that they had something of value and he was damaging that value, and they had to remove him to move forward. With Holmes, she controlled, I think, 99.95% of the board, so there was no chance that she was going to be removed. And the board was just as abysmal and pathetic a board performance as you could have ever seen, in terms of 110% support of her all the time. And then with Adam Neumann, once again, there was a little bit different because he had I'm not quite sure what relationship with the founder of SoftBank, but that founder was basically going to allow him to do anything and fund him to do anything. So 3 different sorts of models there. A couple of things that I would say are with all 3 of those, one of which we've talked about at some length in this series of podcasts, which is the cult of personality. And that not only does the leader believe they can do no wrong, they communicate that belief, and people believe that belief. So you have, and once again, we've talked about him, and he looms over all of these podcasts as Steve Jobs. I think that was an absolute spot-on description of Steve Jobs. But Steve Jobs had people who could deliver the products that he saw in his head. And he was actually a part of that design process as well. But there's something else going on here that Steve Jobs didn't have. And that's really what, see if I can, Mark Epstein and Rob Shelton, writing in Business Insider, called asymmetric power. And that comes in 2 ways. One is control of the board, which is what Elizabeth Holmes had, 100% control of the board. With Adam Neumann, it was control because he had an open checkbook. And with Kalanick, it was because the board, although he did have super voting rights, the board actually chose to back him. And so in 3 different ways, these visionaries had control over the board. The board was supposed to be independent, but it really wasn't. And then in addition to the board issue is the informational control issue, or opaqueness. Each one of these leaders control the information. Elizabeth Holmes perhaps is the most stark example, that she would not let any of her investors do any due diligence on the product that she was peddling, the Theranos product that she said could test blood, and anyone who raised questions was discreetly asked to leave. And so we had a situation, particularly with Walgreens, where their technical staff who wanted to perform due diligence were removed from the acquisition team. So the opaqueness in terms of information only goes one way, and that's to the charismatic founder. So each one of those individuals, I think, controlled information so that the board, even had it chosen to exercise its obligations for control, didn't have the information to do so. And I think in an earlier podcast on Super Pumped, you talked about Lewandowski alleged theft of trade secrets, and that this was noted in the due diligence acquisition report when Uber bought his company, and somehow that information never got to the board.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the roles of the boards in these cases is rather sobering. But it's also the investors here who showed a willful blindness. Now, I think with Kalanick, you're correct. They eventually came around to seeing that he was no longer a positive force for the company and needed to be removed in order to save their own hides. But so they actually got around to doing it. It seems to me that Neumann's big failure was, well, hubris, of course, but when he agreed to do the S1, because that brought all this stuff out from under the rocks. And that released the information that you're talking about. He was so capable at sequestering prior to that.
That's a really interesting take on this, that because he allowed the S1 to go forward. If the point of the company is to go public, and it is at some point to cash in with investors like us, you're going to have to do an S1.
But do you think that was Neumann's point or just his investors? I think they may have had a divergence on this because Neumann was already taking significant sums out in terms of borrowings as well as selling his stock.
So going public was really, when you've already borrowed against $740 million of your stock, that's a really interesting point. And it really brings home something that I mentioned in an earlier podcast, but I want to emphasize again that the market can work. And particularly with WeWork, I think the market worked. And the market is not simply Tom Fox and Richard Lummis investing or any number of institutional investors investing. It is a process by which you have access to capital. And that access to capital requires you to make certain disclosures. You have to disclose your corporate governance. You have to disclose insider trading or self-dealing. You have to disclose who you might owe money to. You have to disclose a wide variety of, if you have material weaknesses in your controls, you have to disclose the status of your controls. So the corporate governance structures are required under securities laws to be disclosed. And that can be a discipline. That can be a control in and of itself. But also here, the market, I think, was repulsed by the failures in these basic corporate governance standards and was not willing to accept investment. Now, obviously the valuation was critical as well, but once again, the market refused the pre-IPO suggested valuation of $47 billion, and it seemed to me that these disparate parts of what we call the market all work together in the situation around WeWork, but
I think they did in Uber's case too, when you look at it.
And in Uber's case. Or if we want to look at another company, Peloton, that went public, original valuation of $25 a share, and immediately dropped, I think, about 30%. And one set of commentary railed on how the age of the IPO was over, and I saw it as completely different, that a robust IPO market, but the market setting the price rather than some owner or key investor saying this is what the price will be in the market, because the stock price is simply future expectations of value.
Well, and I think what's one of the interesting things to me about these cases is the people in the inner circle who actually deal personally with these charismatic founders are the ones with the absurd valuations. It's the ones in the New York office crunching the numbers who are saying, hey, whoa, wait a minute, how is this changing the world?
So the Business Insider article also had a couple of lessons that I'd like to explore around how you deal with charismatic founders and leaders. And the first one was, and really I don't think this would be any surprise, the presence of an authoritarian trailblazer requires special handling. Yes, I would absolutely agree with that. And the handling, I would suggest, Richard, is really the board to have more of a firm guiding hand. And here I do not mean grandma speaking sternly to her grandson, don't do that. I mean actual, not control, but management. And that's the responsibility of the board, is oversight and management. And so I think some boards are very good at that and can be very good at that. But the professionalism at the board level has to take its game up a notch when you have this sort of trailblazer founder or leader.
One of the interesting stories about Uber that we didn't have time to cover was that after a couple of the initial rounds of funding, Bill Gurley of Benchmark tried to introduce Kalanick to another guy who served as a mentor to other people in Silicon Valley and helped them make the transition from startup to grown up, as I like to phrase it. But just bad luck. The guy had cancer and was taking on no more mentees. And so, things could have turned out differently if that had happened. But that's an informal structure that I guess in some cases in Silicon Valley had served as a substitute for the strict board oversight that was maybe a gentler control on these giant egos.
And then the second point they have is the best action to govern, thrive, and survive depends on the type of visionary you're dealing with. And I also saw that as a correct statement, because the three founders we've talked about, Elizabeth Holmes, Adam Neumann, and Travis Kalanick, all were different types of visionaries. So with some, with Neumann perhaps, or Elizabeth Holmes, you risk getting in the way and curtailing their value. But with others, complacency is a huge mistake. So left unsupervised, their behavior could destroy the company. That's certainly true in the case of Elizabeth Holmes. Kalanick seemed to be a little bit different. But once again, to your last point, Richard, it does require a deft touch, and we didn't see that in any of these.
Well, one of the things that struck me is all of these claim to be world-breaking, disruptive changes. If Theranos had worked, it would have been. Uber, I think, has been. I think it has certainly changed the transportation industry, in my opinion, for the better. WeWork, I think we both agree, is an outlier on that. But does iconoclasm necessarily have a messianistic component? Because these people, I think Neumann certainly saw himself as a messiah of some sort, or at least claimed to. Kalanick, I think, at various points felt he was that way too, that he was above the rules.
Perhaps even a road to Damascus component. Certainly, I think that would be actually true of Elizabeth Holmes.
Yeah.
And her vision as well. And then the last article we looked at was one entitled "When to Fire the Boss: A Tale of Three Sackings" by Dan Archer, which appeared in the Business Reporter. And he quoted a source for really the following line: "A boss should quit or be booted out when their staff and investors lose faith in their ability to deliver on their vision." And I thought that was, as general a statement that is, was absolutely spot on. If they can no longer deliver and they truly have become a distraction, it's time for them to leave. And we saw various levels of success in these three corporations with getting the leaders to leave. No success in Theranos. Uber, they did terminate or move Kalanick out. The same with Neumann. Uber's a little bit further along in the process since they have gone IPO and are a public company. It's unclear when, if ever, WeWork will take that step, or the We company, as I suppose we should say. But if they're really not creating value, then perhaps it's just time to move on.
Well, I think that's right, but the question is, at what point? Well, and in certain cases, they become actively destructive of value.
Right.
And many of these people have such egos that they simply cannot let go of any lever of control, I think, without being totally removed.
Well, this has been a fascinating exploration, Richard. We've had a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah, and I think, we've focused on the spectacular failures because they're spectacular. But I think they're also exaggerated instances of problems that people see every day in other contexts. For now, this is Richard Lummis and Tom Fox with 12 O'Clock High. Hope you'll check in next time.
This is Paris Fox again. We hope you enjoyed this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox. If you enjoyed the show, please go to iTunes and rate the podcast. Thank you for listening.